I'm Tony Ruiz of Gold Derby here with Jason Kohn, the director of a fascinating new documentary called Nothing Lasts Forever, which examines the kind of the corporate and institutional fight within the diamond industry. And Jason, it's so funny because when you think about diamonds, there's this image that I think most people have of what a diamond is supposed to mean. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating about the film is what you explore is where that meaning comes from and whether it's even real.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I've always been fascinated by how even like journalism and movies that critique diamonds, it's always quite rightly so about practices in diamond extraction, almost exclusively. Yet every single one of these, pieces of media or entertainment, whatever they are, they always like kind of never investigate the underlying value of the diamond or its preciousness or its role as an aspirational object. It's none of this is ever questioned. And that's the stuff that I actually always thought was so fascinating. All right, so the diamond industry has done all of this generational violence throughout many years. That I think a lot of at least mildly informed people understand and know about. But that's only like literally the tip of the iceberg, because what are they actually fighting for? What is this violence in the service of? And it turns out it's a mythology. It's all a lie. So yeah, that's part of it. But through an actual story of like this kind of secret war that's being fought inside of the diamond industry in order to hide a lot of what's going on in the war with man-made diamonds.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so fascinating is that this film I feel like could have gone any number of ways. And what impressed me so much was that particularly when you start getting into that kind of war between the synthetic industry and the natural diamond industry, it almost plays out like a game of corporate intrigue.
I mean, all right. So so the first character who ever really gave me any access to the diamond world is Dusan, who's in the film. He's the gemologist, and he's really one of the greatest gemologists in the world. I mean, we kind of euphemistically say when somebody's really good at something, oh, they wrote the book on something. I actually have, the synthetic diamond book that identifying synthetic diamonds that Dusan wrote and is in its like 4th or 5th edition. Like he wrote the book on synthetic diamond identification. And when I met him, he was one of the only people in 2015 that was even willing to talk and discuss synthetic diamonds because it was this kind of verboten topic within the industry, which is extremely, sealed off and secretive and tribalistic. And Dusan, I saw this guy, and his job is to, identify the difference between two objects that are identical, which is kind of absurd, right? He's looking for trace signatures of the way that nitrogen atoms, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter. But these objects, man-made diamonds, are real diamonds. And so he's trying to differentiate between two things that are identical. And I thought that this was like a Blade Runner character. Actually, I thought this was a Blade Runner character. He was Blade Runner. And when I told him I saw a Blade Runner style detective in this kind of absurd science fiction style detective story, the first thing he said was, well, Blade Runner is my favorite movie. And that was really, and I always need kind of a genre way into any story, and Blade Runner was the way in for me. And so that kind of dictated stylistic and aesthetic decisions that that helped make the movie feel, I think, a little bit more like sometimes a thriller, sometimes a detective story, also a little bit James Bondish because of all the international travel. But all of that was started with this one reference, and then as I just traveled the world with Dusan, and started meeting a lot of other characters and getting access to this world, it just opened up in other ways.
I was wondering, you made that kind of James Bond reference, which was one of the first things I thought with the mention of because I had never heard the diamond industry referred to as a cartel before. And so if following that analogy, who is Rappaport in this analogy?
Well, Rappaport, it's so funny because that guy he's so smart. He's so charming. He's got such a personality, and I disagree with him so fundamentally about so much. Um, he's absolutely the most famous person in the diamond industry. He can't walk around, the diamond district or diamond trade shows without everybody kind of just, trying to speak to him. I mean, he's he's the mayor of diamonds, essentially, or the president of diamonds. He's definitely the most powerful person, single person, because of this price list. But he's also a complicated figure because he's done a lot for increasing transparency, fighting against conflict diamonds. Like none of these characters are simple. None of them can be kind of, just, you know, explained away as a caricature, because, and I thought that was extremely important, so that it was especially to understand why each character was defending their position and why each character had a position on the diamond industry that they had. So, he tells his first story about his, mother giving him $5,000 to keep in his pocket. And to me, that's extremely psychologically, fundamental to his role in the movie and his motivation in order to protect the diamond as a symbol. Because when you, and he talks about this, when you attribute value to self-worth, that value is more meaningful than just, the dollars and cents, because it has something fundamental about how we feel about ourselves, right? Or it says something fundamental about how we feel about ourselves. So you're actually trying to defend an aspect of yourself, your value system. Anyway, this is getting a little bit heady, I think, but as a character, I found this fascinating. Like I found him fascinating because he's hilarious. Like, he knows how to end sentences, and he's just, his performance is incredible. I mean, I can't help but love him, even though I disagree, very, very much with many of the things that he says.
Well, and I think one of the great aspects of the film is the cross-cutting between the attempted kind of creation of these flawless synthetic diamonds and Rappaport giving that speech at the end. When did that idea come up to really kind of have the film end on that climax?
So every year at the biggest diamond show in the entire world, Rappaport has a breakfast, and it's kind of the state of the union of the diamond industry. And I went to this year after year, trying to get access to Martin. Finally, after, I don't know, 4 or 5 years trying to get access, we got in, and he allowed us to film with him. We did an interview, and then we did, more, and we did that breakfast. When I filmed that breakfast, it was shortly after the trip to China with Dusan. And right after the breakfast, and Dusan was there with me. Right after that breakfast, I was like, this is actually really perfect. This is, to see, what you were doing in China with the man-made diamonds, and I don't want to say too much about it because it is the end of the movie after all. And, it was at that moment I immediately told Dusan the idea. And it made sense, and it was like one of the first things we did. I went back to California and tested it, and sure enough, it was like, yeah, works. We have an ending, which is so important. It's so difficult to have endings in nonfiction films. Like, to me, the movie is, I struggled to make this movie for many, many years because of access. It was so difficult to make, all of the traveling, plus it wasn't clear where the story was going for so long. And in the end, it really ended. At first, it was a joke. All right, this is a character-based essay film with a plot, which is a ridiculous kind of amalgamation of different nonfiction kind of conventions. But like, it really ended up being that thing. But Dusan is the plot. He's the character who's moving through time and space with conflict. There's all these other essay components, which is kind of an argument to be made. And there's these incredible characters, each one just, I think, better than the next. And so it really felt like the war kind of was symbolized between Dusan and Rappaport, especially after they meet in India.
And then in the middle of it, you have the head of De Beers, which I remember the girl who's the Asia. Yeah, she was even shocked that he talked to you. How did you end up getting, and for our audience, De Beers being kind of like the ultimate in the diamond industry, the group behind all the messaging of a diamond being forever. How did you get him?
It took years. The movie, it just, everything took a long time. Asia had written a book also. So Asia's access to the industry came because she was a very high-end jewelry designer. And when she left that line of work, she wrote a best-selling book about the history of diamonds and gems. And in that book, she writes this page-long footnote about trying to interview Stephen Lussier. Stephen Lussier was the CEO of one of the businesses of De Beers, and the head marketing guy. And he strung her along. She went all the way to London. She spent weeks there waiting. I mean, it's this hilarious thing about how they just refused to give the interview without all of these conditions, which she was refusing to give. After so many years of going to diamond shows and traveling with Dusan, I became fairly, I think, recognizable within the diamond industry by people, and I was just the guy following the gemologist. I never lied about anything. I was making a movie about lab-grown diamonds and gemology and also how these stones are being surreptitiously mixed, which still nobody has written about. Which is crazy to me, which is a slightly different question altogether. But man-made diamonds and natural diamonds are being mixed in the market, and not one non-diamond press has ever written a single thing about it, which is crazy. But after all of this time spent going to diamond shows and meeting diamond people, you end up meeting the right people. And because it's such an insular, secretive world, that's all it means, is to meet the right people. So finally I met somebody who introduced me to somebody else that introduced Amanda Branson Gills, my producing partner. She and I were at Las Vegas at this diamond show, and we met Stephen. And we thought it was going to be very, very difficult. But I think the big difference was that when Asia tried to interview him, it was pre-2019. And when or pre-18 or 19, and when we interviewed it, when we tried, it was after De Beers had come out with Lightbox, which is their own man-made diamond division. And they were already now ready to start talking. For the first time, they were ready to start talking about man-made diamonds. And that made all the difference in the entire world.
So just the years that you have put in on this, I guess I'm just curious, how did this idea about looking at the synthetic diamond industry, how did that even come about? Because it's not a topic that most people would go, oh yeah, that's the topic of a film.
Yeah, honestly, for me, it wasn't either for a long time. I had read in 2003 a Wired magazine article about two synthetic diamond companies in American companies that had finally figured out we've been making man-made diamonds, not cubic zirconium, man-made diamonds since the 1950s, but they were always for industrial purposes. And in 2003, there was a Wired article about two American companies that had made big, beautiful, perfect diamonds, undetectable essentially. And the article was written in this kind of hyperbolic fashion, like the diamond industry is going to be dead. And I thought it was a foregone conclusion. I just assumed that the natural diamond industry was going to be made redundant. If you can make diamonds that are real, why would you continue to buy them, knowing everything that we know about the diamond industry? And yet, I think it was about 8 years later, nothing had happened. And coincidentally, I sat next to somebody at a restaurant who had worked as an engineer at one of these diamond companies. I was like, wow, this, and I couldn't believe it. I was blown away. The worst mistake I ever made in my life was not getting this guy's card, because I really would have loved to have, touched base with him. And I was just like, whatever happened? And he's like, it didn't work out. He told me some stories that I only vaguely remember. But at that moment, through that conversation, I realized that the synthetic diamond, was actually being pushed back against. And then I realized, well, actually, I discounted the idea that the natural diamond industry had a story to tell, had always had a story to tell. The synthetic diamond was a new story, and what was going on was a war of narrative. And when I realized that, I was like, oh wow, that's actually really interesting, because that touches on a lot of other things that I'm interested in. A lot, because to me, I mean, it's ridiculous to say that you watch a 90-minute documentary about the diamond industry, synthetic diamonds, and you're hearing about nothing other than diamonds. It's ridiculous for me to say that this has nothing to do with diamonds, but to me, it doesn't have anything to do with diamonds. This is not about diamonds whatsoever. It's a story told through the diamond industry, told through all this conflict. But that was this idea that I couldn't get out of my head, that like, oh, these are stories, and stories have power. Stories can be weaponized. Not all stories are very true, which is something that we see, more abundantly today than ever. And understanding or seeing that, we could tell a story about storytelling itself was very compelling to me, and that's how this whole thing really started.
It's very much to me. It's very much a sociological experiment too, about where our values and what we value come from.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, but narrative is a big part of that, right? It's like the stories that we are told as children, the stories that we choose to believe, the stories that we want to believe, the stories that are our friends and our community believes. These, more than anything, construct what we call our value systems. And so, dissecting, deconstructing, and understanding where those stories come from, who creates those stories, how they're disseminated to us, the interests behind those particular stories. I mean, that's to me what everything, right? Like that's everything. So again, at heart, what it was most important to tell a story that was fun and entertaining and cool, with like great characters and a lot of conflict and intrigue and all of that. But at heart, this is what we're actually talking about right now, is what the movie's really about. Yeah.
Did it do films do when you're done with a film, how do you know that you've got it? How do you know that you're done? Right. Or do you ever know that you're done?
Yeah, I mean, after that much long working on this movie, I had to be done at some point, and I was praying for something to become so obvious that I would say, okay, enough already, and that happened because I did an interview with Asia Radin, and that was the last interview I had done, and I had met Asia because somebody had recommended to Amanda Branson, my producing partner, to read her book. Her book is hilarious. It's great. And it was very, very much.
She is such a character.
And after that interview, she was so funny and so good and so performative. And we became friends, and she's wonderful. But it was like, okay, you know what? There's nothing left to be said. And it just was like, okay, we've wrapped this movie. We can really be editing now and go in full force. Now, editing took another 18 months or something, but nothing was short on this film. But the interview with Asia was really that moment when I could say, okay, the picture's in the can.
Well, it's such a fascinating film of something I had zero idea about, and I think it's really important. Hopefully, people get a chance to see and ask questions and really look at this. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the upcoming award season, and stay tuned for interviews with more contenders throughout. Jason Kohn, a great film, Nothing Lasts Forever. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Really, I enjoyed this a lot. Thank you.